Robbie Lawler is one of the most relentless and fearless fighters to ever step into the octagon. He wasn't your typical clean-cut champion, he was the embodiment of violence, turning every fight into a war. His title reign wasn't just about winning, it was about delivering some of the most brutal, unforgettable battles in MMA history. From a teenage prodigy training with the best to becoming one of the most feared champions, Robbie's journey was nothing short of legendary. Lawler's path to greatness didn't begin in a major fight hub, but in Bettendorf, Iowa, a tough Midwestern town where grit and resilience were part of everyday life. As a kid, he excelled in sports like football and wrestling, standing out not just for his athletic ability, but for his sheer intensity. At 16, he found his way to Miletic Fighting Systems, a legendary gym run by MMA pioneer Pat Miletich. Training alongside future champions like Matt Hughes and Tim Sylvia, Lawler was thrown into the deep end from the start. He didn't just survive, he thrived. Miletich immediately recognized Robbie's raw power and fearlessness, shaping him into a fighter capable of competing with the best. At just 20 years old, Lawler made his UFC debut in 2002, and it didn't take long for him to make an impression. His first fight against Aaron Riley was a glimpse into the kind of fighter he would become: aggressive, relentless, and willing to throw down at any moment. Though the fight went to a decision, fans knew they were watching someone special. Robbie wasn't there to play it safe. He was there to go to war. However, his aggressive style came with risks. While his knockout power made him a fan favorite, it also left him vulnerable to counterattacks. By 2004, after a string of tough losses, he found himself cut from the UFC. For many, this would have been the end, but for Lawler, it was just another challenge. He spent years grinding through smaller promotions like Elite XC and Strikeforce, refining his skills and learning how to balance his wild aggression with strategy. By the time he returned to the UFC in 2013, he was no longer just a brawler. He was a smarter, more complete fighter. His comeback fight against Josh Koscheck was a statement. Lawler displayed patience, precision, and his signature knockout power, finishing Koscheck in the first round. From there, he went on a tear, racking up wins and proving he was still a force to be reckoned with. But it was his fight against Rory MacDonald at UFC 189 that truly defined his legacy. In what is widely considered one of the greatest fights in MMA history, Lawler and MacDonald engaged in a brutal 5-round war. Both men suffered tremendous damage. MacDonald's nose was shattered, Lawler's lip was split wide open, but neither backed down. In the final round, with both fighters barely standing, Robbie found the opening he needed, unleashing a combination that broke MacDonald's spirit and ended the fight. Bloodied but victorious, he stood in the octagon, staring down his fallen opponent with an intensity that would become the stuff of legend. To claim the welterweight title, Lawler had to go through Johnny Hendricks, a powerhouse known for his wrestling and knockout power. Their first fight was an all-out war, with Hendricks edging out a razor-thin decision. But in the rematch, Lawler left no doubt, unleashing a relentless assault in the final round to secure the belt. As champion, he didn't sit back. He engaged in some of the most violent battles the sport had ever seen. His fight against Carlos Condit was another 5-round war, with Lawler digging deep in the final moments to edge out a split-decision victory. What made Lawler so special wasn't just his knockout power or durability, it was his unbreakable will. He didn't just fight to win, he fought to break his opponents, to push beyond his own limits. That infamous cold stare before a fight, the way he absorbed shots and kept moving forward, and his ability to find another gear in the 5th round made him a terrifying opponent. His fights weren't just competitions, they were tests of pure grit. But with every war came a cost. Years of battles took a toll on Lawler's body. His face carried the scars of countless wars, his hands required constant repairs, and his recovery times grew longer. Yet, even as the physical toll mounted, his spirit remained unshaken. After over 20 years in the sport, Lawler had one last fight ahead of him. Facing Nico Price, a younger, dangerous knockout artist, many assumed this would be a passing of the torch. But Robbie Lawler wasn't about to go out quietly. In just 38 seconds, he turned back the clock, unleashing a furious barrage that left Price crumpled on the canvas. It was the perfect ending, one last violent masterpiece to cap off an unforgettable career. Robbie Lawler's career is one of those rare stories in MMA stop talking about. When people praise him, it's not just because of his accomplishments, it's because of the way he fought, the attitude he carried, and the moments he gave to the sport that felt larger than life. From the beginning, he wasn't just another fighter trying to climb the ranks. He was something different, something special, a presence in the cage that demanded respect. There was never a time in his career when he played it safe. He was the type of fighter who could have extended his longevity by adopting a more tactical, risk-averse style. But that just wasn't him. Robbie Lawler believed in one thing: fighting with everything he had. It didn't matter if he was on a winning streak or coming off a tough loss. When he stepped into that octagon, it was about proving himself every single time. That kind of mentality is what made him such a fan favorite. There was an authenticity to his approach that you don't see in a lot of fighters. He wasn't trying to be something he wasn't. He wasn't calling people out for attention or hyping up fights with words. He let his performances speak for themselves, and they spoke volumes. A huge part of why people admire him is his resilience. Most fighters have ups and downs in their careers, but few have rebounded from setbacks the way Robbie Lawler did. There were points where it looked like he had peaked early, like he had all the potential in the world but couldn't quite put it all together. When he left the UFC the first time, people assumed he would fade away. But he didn't. He kept fighting, kept evolving, kept sharpening his skills. He never lost sight of who he was, and that's what made his return to the UFC so incredible. When he came back in 2013, it was like watching a fighter reborn. He wasn't just the raw knockout artist anymore. He was calculated, composed, and even more dangerous. He wasn't just swinging wildly and hoping to land something big. He had developed a patience that made him even scarier. His ability to take damage and keep moving forward was unmatched, but now he had an understanding of how to pace himself, when to explode, and how to break opponents down over time. There's a reason his fights are talked about as some of the greatest in MMA history. He wasn't just involved in exciting fights, he was the architect of them. His fights against Rory MacDonald, Johnny Hendricks, and Carlos Condit weren't just brawls. They were showcases of everything that makes MMA beautiful and brutal at the same time. They were tests of skill, endurance, and willpower. His fight with Rory MacDonald at UFC 189, for example, is the kind of fight that people will be talking about decades from now. It wasn't just a title defense, it was a war. There was something about the way he stood there at the end of the fourth round, bloodied and battered, staring into Rory's eyes like he was daring him to keep going. That moment alone is why people love Robbie Lawler. He had no quit in him. When most fighters would be looking for a way to survive, he was looking for a way to break his opponent's spirit. It wasn't just that he won fights, it was how he won them. His knockout power was one thing, but his ability to push through adversity and find another level in the later rounds was something truly special. A lot of fighters start strong but fade as the fight goes on. Robbie was the opposite. If you couldn't put him away early, you were in trouble. That's what made him so dangerous, especially in 5-round fights. It didn't matter how much punishment he took, he always had more to give. Even when he lost, he earned respect. That's rare in MMA, where fans can be brutal and quick to dismiss fighters after a tough loss. But with Robbie, it was different, because even in defeat, he gave everything he had. There was no shame in losing to him, and when he lost, he never made excuses. He never blamed the judges, never complained about injuries, he just moved on, got back in the gym, and prepared for the next fight. That kind of attitude is why fellow fighters respect him just as much as the fans do. Beyond the wars he put himself through, there was also the fact that he carried himself like a true professional. He wasn't one for trash talk or mind games. He never needed to build hype with drama. When you saw his name on a fight card, you knew what you were getting. An absolute battle. He respected the sport, respected his opponents, and never let the business side of things change who he was as a fighter. He also had this ability to inspire. He wasn't the most technical fighter, he wasn't the flashiest, but he had heart, and that made up for everything. He was proof that toughness, grit, and determination could take you to the top just as much as athleticism or skill. Young fighter, his final fight against Nico Price was the perfect send-off. A lot of great fighters don't get to go out on their own terms. They fight too long, take too many losses, and fade away instead of going out with one last great performance. But Robbie? He made sure his last fight was a reminder of who he was. He didn't drag it out. He didn't let it be a long, grueling war. Instead, he did what he had done so many times before. He came out, landed bombs, and finished it in violent fashion. The fact that he ended his career with a knockout win is just so fitting. It's exactly how it was supposed to happen. One last glimpse of the ruthless Robbie Lawler that fans had come to love over the years. No drawn-out farewell tour, no dramatic exit. Just one last fight, one last finish, and then walking away with his head held high. That's why everyone praises him. It's not just about the wins, the knockouts, or even the title reign. It's about the way he fought, the way he carried himself, and the legacy he left behind. He didn't just participate in MMA, he helped define an era of it. He reminded people what fighting was really about. Robbie Lawler is the kind of fighter who only comes around once in a generation. He wasn't the biggest talker, wasn't the most technical, and never tried to sell himself as anything other than what he was, a fighter's fighter, a warrior in the truest sense. And that's why, long after his gloves have been hung up, people will still be talking about him, because fighters like Robbie Lawler don't just fade away, they become legends. Dana White summed it up best. He's been here since he was 19 years old. He's been in a lot of wars, held titles, and had a special career. Lawler walked away from the sport the same way he entered it, on his own terms, fists flying and head held high. He wasn't just a champion, he was a warrior, a legend, and one of the most ruthless fighters to ever grace the Octagon.